All right, hello everyone. You're listening to You Got It with Warrior Woman 91. All right, everyone. I've been looking forward to having this guest on my show, my former Daily Wire co-worker and resident Catholic monarch, Paul Bois. He's joining us today straight from Los Angeles, California. Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Kelly. It's good to talk with you.
So, Paul, I've been doing my best to stay away from politics on this show for the most part, but unfortunately politics just seem to continue creeping back into my life and everyone else's, so we're just going to have to dive right back into it. So by the time this episode airs next week, it'll be over a week ago that several just the most horrific mass shootings occurred over the weekend. The reaction to these shootings from a political sphere, or from the political sphere, has been explosive to say the least. What is your take on the whole situation and kind of how people have reacted to it?
Well, I mean, following every tragedy, I would say the most unfortunate thing is that it always gets politicized. Some to a healthy degree, and of course a lot to an unhealthy degree. I think with every tragedy that occurs, we have to be sorrowful and join in mourning and do the best we can to provide comfort to the victims in every case. In terms of the political reaction, I mean, it's always the same thing. What we have is, of course, one side saying, we need to ban all the guns, confiscate the guns, enact insane gun control measures, which is to, ban what they call to be assault rifles and assault weapons. And then what I'm seeing right now, at least from among conservatives, is I am seeing some sensible measures being promoted, such as the red flag laws and the GBROs, and I do in some way seeing a reactionary response to that, and not allowing, I think, the issue to get a fair and reasonable debate.
Mm. So we'll end up getting to the red flag laws in a minute, but it seems like the country just doesn't seem to be being brought together on this issue at all. We can't even seem to have like a moment of, let's just grieve for a minute and acknowledge that both sides are pretty shaken up by this tragedy. We see progressives releasing target lists with names and businesses on them for people to harass. And I guess my question for you is just why do you think this kind of behavior has been encouraged and really normalized by the left?
I think because largely the left views itself in a moral prism that thinks that what the convictions that they hold are 100% correct, and the positions that conservative holds are backwards and immoral, and people who are backwards and immoral, they essentially deem that they can do anything to try and stop them. Hence why Representative Joaquin Castro docked several members of his district who donated to Donald Trump, because in his mind he views those people as people who are contributing to a future of white supremacy and racism, and so because he has defined them as such, he can go ahead and disrupt their lives in such a way. And of course, people like Joe Scarborough of MSNBC have endorsed that view. That's the best summation that I can give it. That's the only thing that I think can lead somebody to be so hostile and cruel towards their fellow man, towards their fellow neighbor, is the belief that they have the moral authority to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just that's the thing that really bugs me the most is it's a dehumanizing way of treating another person to target and harass them, whether it's through doxing them or it's just through standing outside of Mitch McConnell's house and screaming at him while he's he's under bed rest or whatever. Like, we can't treat people like human beings anymore just because we have some disagreements for some reason. It's just very frustrating to me.
I agree. And I mean, part of the problem with American political discourse, especially from what I can see now, is that we have a lack of an ability to differentiate between prudence and morality. You know, for instance, like what is immoral, right to life. So when debating an issue like abortion, that's a moral issue. That's not a prudential issue. Yet people turn it into a prudential issue. When debating something like the Second Amendment, you know, the moral is, of course, that we all have the right to defend ourselves. We all have the right to own a firearm. Of course, we are responsible, law-abiding citizens. Prudence is how do we ensure that people who are not responsible, law-abiding citizens don't get a firearm. And that's where the debate happens. But people, of course, conflate. They say that it's immoral to own a firearm, and therefore we can take people's firearms away from them. And that's really where the breakdown comes. I don't think a good portion of America is able to properly differentiate between what is moral and what is prudence. So if somebody believes that something that is prudential is moral, you'll get all kinds of nasty, crazy reactions. You know, if someone just say, well, you know, I think, yeah, you have a right to, you know, own a firearm. Oh my gosh, you're evil. You're terrible. You have to be silenced and, you know, harassed. That's where it happens. If you believe that something that is prudential is moral, and somebody doesn't agree with you on that, therefore you think that you have moral authority to destroy them.
Yeah, it's really become just a completely toxic environment. But that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show, because I know you and I disagree about some of our policy prescriptions for how to deal with this, and I really just kind of wanted to hear your explanation from kind of not opposing view, but, you know, a different view from mine on how to deal with the issue of mass murderers and so on and so forth. So this is kind of another division that's happening, and it's happening within the Republican Party, as you mentioned earlier, with these new red flag laws. And one of the things I just wanted to start this off with was having you define for people, because there's a lot of people that hear red flag laws and don't know what that means. Can you just explain to the audience exactly what that is, and then what your position is on them?
Okay, well, basically the red flag law, and they do differ state by state. It's not wholesale. There are differences of application, different rules. So it's not something that you can just like broadly define. But if I had to sum it up, a red flag law essentially is this: it provides local law enforcement a means to temporarily restrict somebody from obtaining a firearm based on a testimony either from a family member or a neighbor that provides them compelling evidence to show that the person is a potential harm to society. And you know, within that, there's certain due process that's in place. The burden of proof is typically on the person who brings forth the complaint, and they have to provide compelling evidence, and the judge has to weigh that evidence to determine if the person can have a moratorium placed on his right to own a firearm. That's essentially it in a nutshell. Of course, it differentiates, but that's probably the simplest explanation.
So, where do you stand on these laws for the audience's benefit?
I would have to say that I support the red flag laws, mostly because I've examined the arguments from conservatives against it, and the only compelling argument that I've actually found is that they can be abused. And I'll get that to in a moment why I don't think that's necessarily a legitimate reason not to implement them. The idea that red flag laws are unconstitutional, I just don't think washes. You have to basically say that restraining orders are unconstitutional, or any ordinance whatsoever that restricts certain forms of speech in the context of disturbing the public good. I mean, the fact of the matter is that every single inalienable right we have is always subject to the common good. I mean, take, for instance, the First Amendment. An abuse of the First Amendment would of course be if I'm blaring my music at 3 a.m. In my house and I'm disturbing my neighbor. Mm-hmm. So if my neighbor calls the cops on me and basically the cops say I have to shut it off or I'm going to get fined, I can't go ahead and say, well, I'm using free speech, First Amendment right. At the end of the day, my First Amendment right to expression, has to be subject to the common good at an extent. And here's the thing, not all abuses of certain rights are created equally. So, in the case of the abuse of the First Amendment, the consequence of my abuse is minuscule. Somebody loses sleep that night, there's maybe a little bit of civil unrest that happens, but ultimately, it's not an astronomical consequence of somebody abusing their First Amendment right like that. Mm. So, therefore, it is completely a gross overreach for the government to put in restrictions in place or have me go through hoops to prevent or have me buy a stereo, because the chances of me abusing it and the consequences of me abusing it are very small. However, when it comes to obtaining a firearm, the abuse of obtaining a firearm, somebody who abuses owning a firearm, the consequences of that are astronomical. Mm-hmm. The thing is dead. A terrorist disaster, a generation of life is wiped out. We as a nation have to suffer a tragedy. Therefore, it is not a gross overreach to have a system in place that seeks to prevent people who are going to abuse that right from getting a firearm. It's not unconstitutional. It's wholly within the realm of the common good. I'm very hard pressed. You'd be very hard pressed to find anybody who, if you were to tell them, oh yeah, this person was keeping rape lists and hit lists, and yet they were still able to obtain a firearm. I don't think that you're going to get them on your side by opposing the red flag laws. I know it sounds like I'm rambling here a little bit, but yeah, that's that.
No, I mean, your argument on the constitutional grounds, I think is completely fair. My biggest concern, and you actually pointed this out, that the biggest concern is the abuse of these laws, and that's really why I currently am against them, because I would be afraid of that abuse. I guess my biggest worry would be twofold, whether it's the government abusing the laws and using it as kind of a stepping stool to taking more guns away, or, you give them an inch and they take a mile kind of a scenario. And then I can also see on an individual level, let's say there's a next door neighbor, because I've studied to a small extent the rape statistics, and it always ends up being somebody who's close to or in a close proximity, or who is somewhat acquainted with the woman who ends up being the rapist. And what if it ends up being a next door neighbor who's interested in committing that kind of crime and is able to get a gun restraining order? Obviously, this is totally hypothetical, but and then is able to have the guns removed from a house and goes in and rapes a person, or even if it's a family member of a person who's had their guns taken away and now their children are left unprotected. Again, it's just the abuse of these laws is really the crux of my concerns right there.
I do understand that, and like I said, I think that's the most compelling argument that conservatives brought forth. The reason why that doesn't necessarily wash with me is because every single law that we have in place to prevent crime or punish crime can and has been abused. Mm-hmm. For instance, there are hundreds of false allegations of rape. We've covered them multiple times on the Daily Wire. Certainly we saw that during the Kavanaugh hearings. But just because there are going to be false allegations of something doesn't necessarily mean now we put relaxations on sexual assault laws. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. So every single law that we have in place can be abused. Of course it can be. And that is why when I think conservatives and Second Amendment proponents certainly should not just draw away from this and just let politicians create this without their involvement. I think they should very much be involved in the process of drafting these red flag law legislations, and they should very much seek to have very clear rules, very clear guidelines in place, and about the burden of proof and the evidence that should be brought forward to determine if someone is going to be a potential risk, to minimize the amounts of people who are going to be subjected to false accusations with this. I don't think that that's going to be a epidemic, as people are characterizing it as. I certainly think that we should be watchful of it, but just because something is going to be abused, I don't think that that's the correct reason not to implement something that's morally correct. Because, like I said, we have laws on the books that are morally correct, and yet they still can be abused. So,
right. Yeah, I guess the other kind of qualm I have with it is, so, because you're obviously right, you're taking a risk every time you enact a new law. You're taking a risk that it's going to be abused. So I guess the other question I have for you is, do you feel like the kind of risk reward relationship between enacting a red flag law and the potential for it to be abused, do you feel like they're actually going to work, I guess is the question, because I just wonder how many of these mass shootings are you really going to avoid by having somebody's guns taken away for a temporary amount of time? Are they just going to go out and get a knife and do the same kind of damage or similar damage? I guess that's the other question I have on that.
Sure. I certainly think the trouble is these are relatively new laws that are being proposed, so we don't actually have a lot of data in place to determine if they will prevent mass shootings or not. So that is something important to keep in mind. I mean, they did enact it in Florida, and one sheriff out there has pretty much said that they think that they made the right call. We do. That is the thing. We don't have the evidence yet to show whether or not this works, but we do have the evidence to show that there were individuals who had very clear red flag laws, and they were looked at by law enforcement, and family members even warned about it, and people warned about it, and nothing happened. So we do know that there were cases of people that could have very easily been stopped, but they weren't stopped. So but again, look, this is it's always an experiment. I mean, America is an experiment, and democracy is an experiment, and I think that we should allow states and local municipalities to implement this to see what happens, what we can get. If we can curtail a few mass shootings, I absolutely think it would be. I certainly think it would help Second Amendment proponents to not have to deal with this like every single month, every single week. We're having to debate this over and over again because every time one of these happens, the debate is always shifting. It's not about common sense gun control laws. It's always going to be confiscate the guns, get rid of the Second Amendment, confiscate the guns, get rid of the Second Amendment, and the left never stops repeating it. They will keep repeating it until eventually it gets ingrained in people's systems and people get tired and they go, okay, well, let's just get rid of the guns. So we have to be able to do what we can, that which is prudential and that which is moral in a given moment. And at least with something like this, we're trying. We're trying.
I do think you have a pretty well thought out position on this, and this is really why I wanted to have you on, because even though you and I do disagree on several issues, you always are very, you actually think about what you believe before you go out and, spout it on the internet or whatever. So I just wanted this to be an example for the audience. Please take note. Don't go out and say stuff unless you've thought it through like Paul Bois, because even though I disagree with him on some of this stuff, we're able to have a reasonable conversation and we're able to talk about it, and he's able to make some really good points that I can at least say, okay, I disagree, but I respect his position. So the other thing, this is kind of a weird segue, but there's an issue that I think, got swept to the wayside, that was in last week's news cycle, and it was regarding the issue of the guy who went on. It was a PragerU show, and I think his name was Mario Lopez, and he went on the show. Yeah, and so he I guess said something to the effect of, I don't want to tell people how to raise their kids, but I also just don't think that 3 years old is a good idea or a good age for people to be making decisions about whether they're male or female. And he was raked over the coals. It was like he was the new Donald Trump / Hitler / whatever other terrible, horrible human being you can say. And he was forced to apologize and all the rest of it. So I thought, Paul, you would be a good person to have on and talk about this, because I just think the reaction, it's similar to the gun control thing, is the left they refuse to budge on the issue. They refuse to allow for anybody to have a different opinion other than theirs, and they're going to just destroy you if you dare speak out against, or even. I mean, the guy wasn't rude about it. He was very, genteel and saying, I'm not trying to tell people what to do. This is just what I think. And so I guess my question for you is, what are the dangers of this kind of mob mentality of the left? Like, do you see this really being a benefit to anybody?
Certainly not. If the left thinks they can literally destroy and handle someone because they think that a 3-year-old shouldn't be deciding their gender, their sex, and their parents just going along with it and dressing a boy up as a girl. We have some serious trouble on our hands. My problem with that whole thing, honestly, was I was very disappointed in Mario Lopez and his reaction to it. Mm-hmm. I really wish that, because it took him less than 24 hours to just totally cave, and that was really unfortunate. I wish that he had stuck to his guns, and I wish he had just said, yes, I hold my convictions, no, I don't have any animus or hate towards transgender individuals, or he wasn't even talking about transgenderism as a whole, as a movement. He was just talking about 3-year-olds. Right. I mean, the fact that he himself just wouldn't hold to that was really unfortunate. And if we are going to beat this thing, we have to be able to say it clearly and in one voice, and that no, this is the truth, and hold to that, because if we don't, they will be able to steamroll over us, and it will get very ugly and very bad. And in terms of what this means to the rest of the country, I do think we need to address the fact that most Americans, the majority of the country, agree with Mario Lopez, agree that no, a 3-year-old should not be deciding their own gender. Mm-hmm. The trouble is, as it always is, a small minority and these people are in the elite, they're in Hollywood, they're in other parts of government, they very much want to push that agenda, and those are the people that we need to target, those are the people that we need to stop, and have to ensure that they don't carry it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's two problems I have with this. One is that the left seems to just completely set aside the issue of there's a difference between a 3-year-old saying that they're the opposite gender and an 18-year-old. Because when you're 18, I mean, I think that it's still, not a healthy thing for any person to be messing with their body in that way. However, when you're 18, you're legally able to make decisions for yourself. When you're 3 years old, you can't make decisions about what you're going to eat for dinner. So, I mean, I think that's where the biggest absurdity for me comes up with that part of the argument. And then the other thing I have an issue with just in general is this kind of normalization of transgenderism. And this is not meant to be hateful in any way, but I watch a lot of videos with various people who are transgender, and there are actually some really nice people who are transgender, Blair White being one of them. Blair White has actually even made the case, though, on Blair's channel that even for people who transition, you should have a way. You should leave your options open. Is basically the case that Blair was making, and just in case you want to go back. So I guess this kind of mental conditioning that we're jumping into, and this kind of this just dive into surgical alterations. We need to do this now. We need to do this right. And you need to make this decision by the time you're 12, and you need to have your hormones start going, and you need to start having surgeries and plastic surgery and all the rest of it. I mean, even somebody who's almost 100%, surgically transitioned as much as a person can. Blair has decided not to do the final surgery just because Blair wants to leave the door open in case. I'm never sure which pronoun to use for Blair, but in case Blair wants to go back. So I guess what is your take on this? And it just seems like there's a large part of transgenderism that has just become a fad, and so that's kind of what I wanted to have you address. Is most of this just a fad?
I certainly think it's certainly the cause célèbre of the day.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I think when people who are talking about same-sex marriage and the complete and total acceptance of homosexual activity across the board, again, this isn't just talking about being, kind and tolerant towards people. People were acting like, just live and let live. It's not going to be, a thing, who are you to judge kind of thing. It doesn't surprise me one bit that now that flag has been planted, the goalposts have essentially shifted, and now we're talking about transgenderism, the ability to just choose your gender, whatever it is you want, and then once that flag has pretty much been planted, I wouldn't be surprised if transgenderism is a thing of the past. That's antiquated. That's the conservative position.
Mm-hmm.
Where now it's whatever it is, who are you to push a label on me, a gender at all? I'm just me. It's always, the goalposts are always going to be shifting, always. And because something that's not stated in the truth is people are always going to be looking for novelty. And there's always going to be somebody that has a novel position or a novel form of identity that they want the world to accept. I do think it is a fad. I do think the people who are involved with it certainly are sincere in what they believe, and people fall into the idea of false compassion. That compassion means total acceptance of whatever anybody says. But overall, yes, I think it is a fad. I think it will most likely change in another 20 years, 10 years, and we'll have a whole different cause on our hands if, of course, they are able to plant the flag, which they certainly want to do. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit more hopeful. I don't know. I don't think that they're going to be able to win on transgenderism. I think the way that they were able to win on same-sex marriage, because same-sex marriage was, in a sense, it's just hey, they just want to get married, who are you, you're mean, that kind of thing. And they're yeah, I guess you're right, I wouldn't want someone doing that to me. But with something like this, it's just you're asking people to just deny reality. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're just going to say, no, you know what, I really just am not cool with the idea of having to share a bathroom with somebody who is not of the same biological sex as me. I'm not comfortable with having my daughter or my son in showers with people who are of the opposite sex. It's not something. I think ultimately people will say, okay, we're going too far here. So I'm hopeful about that. On the flip side, however, the left never wins at the ballot box. Nothing they ever propose is able to persuade enough people for them to enact their agenda. That's why they always go to the courts. Mm-hmm. But that is exactly why I voted for Donald Trump and why I'm very happy to vote for him in 2020, because those judicial appointments are everything. Mm-hmm. Everything. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really an unfortunate situation that we've come to in this country where the legislatures have just pretty much been bypassed. We either go to the executive branch when we want something done, and then it's like a temporary fix, or we go to the judiciary, and then it's like this long term. We can never change this thing again, even though science says that this is completely wrong, as in Roe versus Wade. But just kind of going back to the transgenderism as a fad thing, I do think, there are some people that are legitimately mentally ill, and they do think or have these feelings of, I must not be in the right body or whatever it happens to be. But when I refer to transgenderism as a fad, it's for the majority of the other people that are participating in it. Not necessarily, they might not necessarily be transitioning, but they're the ones with the pitchforks and the torches and coming after people with, or who happen to disagree with it, or who don't feel comfortable using pronouns that are not biologically accurate. If it's for some reason any kind of disagreement on these issues anymore, it's just, you have to be shut down. How dare you disagree? You can't disagree anymore. So I guess that's kind of the final point I wanted to have us talk about is what can we do to try to, I don't know, make it easier to have conversations with people going forward, because it's just becoming so polarized. You can't talk to anybody.
Sorry, Kelly, you're cutting out.
No worries. So the question basically is, what can we do going forward to try to make it easier for people to have conversations without being completely polarized?
Yeah, I think you got to get off social media. Absolutely, get off social media. Social media is a sewer of conversation. Stop doing it. Stop trying to debate people on social media. Just don't. That's my honest opinion. I think you need to get out there. I need to talk with people face to face, individually. I certainly know many people who have done that and are doing that. And I think when you're able to remove that wall between the two of you, it becomes a lot harder for someone to just go, well, you're awful and terrible. Now, of course, there are individuals out there who just have no ability to control their emotions whatsoever. And those people who are toxic, don't engage with them. What are you going to do? But a good majority of people out there, even people who think a certain way on this issue, as you start talking to them and you start getting reasonable with them, they begin to see, I somewhat see your point there. I see, that's going a little too far, So, it's very important that we get in face-to-face conversations with people. They can see your humanity so that they don't just get to dismiss it like so easily they can on social media, and be compassionate and understanding about where they're coming from without giving up your principles and your morals on the issue.
I totally agree. I think there's a big difference between talking to somebody in person who you disagree with, or even talking to somebody on the phone who you disagree with, and talking to somebody over the internet who's a nameless, faceless person that you can just abuse. It's just so easy to abuse that. I really appreciate you coming on, Paul. I've been looking forward to this episode for, I think, now 2 weeks. So I'm very glad to have had you come on, and I think the audience is really going to enjoy this discussion we've had.
Good. Thank you so much, Kelly. I appreciate it. You have yourself a wonderful day.
All right. You too.